Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Cutblock. I'm your host, Dan Pierce, and today on the show, I'm joined by Joan Baxter, a Canadian journalist and author currently residing in Nova Scotia. Joan's obsessions are very similar to my own: climate, environment, and corporate capture. And her reporting has appeared in the BBC, Al Jazeera, the Globe and Mail, the Guardian, and the Halifax Examiner. Joan, welcome to the Cutblock, and thank you so much for being my very first guest on this show.
Thank you, Dan. I'm honored and flattered.
Wonderful. Joan, I've been digging into your work the past few days, and I've been just thoroughly impressed by the scope of your reporting on mining and energy and logging and climate and lots more. But the reason I wanted to have you on the show today is to talk about the federal election, which is currently in full swing, and specifically your recent article in the Halifax Examiner, in which you raised a question I think's on a lot of our minds these days. Where have all the climate issues gone in this election? Maybe some things have changed in the days since you have written that article. So I'm excited to talk to you. But before we dive into that, I'd just like to start by casting our minds back to 2019, 2020, which I think was really the high watermark for climate activism in Canada. Greta Thunberg was on her meteoric rise. Youth were leading massive climate marches in the streets with hundreds of thousands of people in tow, one of which was former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. I'll never forget that image of Trudeau marching in Montreal with kids under each arm holding Save Our Earth placards. As if he was just another guy, and not the prime minister of this country whose job it was to actually set the climate agenda. So jump forward to 2020, 2021. The pandemic obviously takes a lot of the wind out of the sails of a lot of activism. But nevertheless, in the 2021 federal election, climate policies were still top of mind for a lot of voters. It was overshadowed by COVID recovery, somewhat, but Trudeau was still out there hyping his climate plan, including the centerpiece of his agenda, the carbon tax. Now, jump forward again to today, and of course Trump is sucking all the air out of the room, threatening to invade us. Tariffs are on, tariffs are off, total market chaos. But this election kicks off with Trudeau getting the boot, Mark Carney takes over, and the crown jewel of Trudeau's climate legacy, the carbon tax, is immediately abandoned by Mark Carney. So that really sets the tone of how this whole election got started. So Joan, take it from there. As this election unfolds, where does climate change policy currently stand in the political discourse at this moment in time? And like I said, it might have actually changed a little bit from when you wrote that article just days ago. But what are the candidates saying or not saying about the climate crisis?
Well, when I started researching the article, and that's about a week before it actually came out, which was last weekend, I think. Time passes quite quickly during this election campaign. I was just sitting all the time. I'm a CBC listener, and I would listen to discussions and newscasts, and they would have young voters on or old voters on, and even the media themselves were kind of suggesting what are the top issues to you, and climate was never one of them. Maybe that's the fault of the media more than it is of the public, because as I said in the article, an Abacus poll did show that climate still is number 6 on the list of issues for Canadians. And I do understand that sovereignty, when you feel like a country's going to be invaded, sovereignty and this economic chaos around us is very destabilizing. And it was bad enough before because people can't afford housing and groceries are so expensive and so on. But of course, some of those things relate to climate change too. But yeah, it just seemed to have been erased from the whole campaign. And I would say it was perhaps 50% the responsibility of the candidates. But I would also say the media had a big role to play, because the media do shape conversations. And I have a feeling that an awful lot of the media they either downplay it or just plain ignore it. So it was not there. So I went looking for people who are a lot smarter than I am, who are looking at these issues. One is Thomas Arneson McNeill, who's with the Ecology Action Centre here in Nova Scotia, and he confirmed what I suspected, that, yeah, it's very frustrating. It's just not there. And instead, what we're getting is a lot of oil and gas propaganda and politicians leaping on the pipeline bandwagon. And I also contacted Julia Levin from Environmental Defence, and she said exactly the same thing. And both of them also said to me, there's a reason that it's been disappeared from the campaign, and that has to do with the oil and gas industry in Canada. They are very powerful, they have a lot of money, and they have been shaping the narrative in their favor for a long time, but they're taking advantage of this Trump crisis to really play some serious disaster capitalism. The crisis is here, so then they come in and say that they've got the solution. And as I say, when I wrote the article, it just wasn't there. And this wasn't just me, it was also my own children saying that to me. Where's the climate crisis gone? Like, we're really worried about the climate crisis, but the candidates aren't talking about it. So that's where we were when I wrote the article.
Mm-hmm. And in the days since you've written the article, have there been any new developments that have been, that have changed your view on that at all?
Well, it's interesting because Julia Levin from Environmental Defence, one of her last comments to me was, if we're going to go elbows up in Canada, let's go elbows up for the climate. And interestingly enough, it turns out that while she was saying that to me, the mayors across Canada and municipal councillors were busy signing a letter called Elbows Up for the climate. And that was last Friday. I just learned about that letter today. It's signed by, I believe, 80 mayors and councillors across the country, not nearly as many as I would have liked to have seen. For example, there's no municipal council or mayor from Halifax signed it. Of course, Montreal was involved, Edmonton was involved. So it was good to see that there was this letter. So yes, they're trying to put it onto the agenda for the federal election, municipal politicians. And one of the things that Thomas Anderson McNeil said to me during the interviews, and they were quite long, the interviews that we did about what should we be looking at in the Trump crisis in Canada, because we can't just sit there and throw our hands in the air. We have to have solutions. And he said a solution would be massive investment, instead of in oil and gas subsidies, would be massive investment in wind and solar and a national grid connecting all of the grids right across Canada, so that this gets over the intermittency problem that you have with wind and solar. Right now, for example, there's no wind here and there's no sun here. So obviously, this would be a moment when you would have that wonderful grid, so you could be bringing in power from places where you do have the power production. And he said, we need a power line, not pipelines. And interestingly enough, I see that yesterday in the Liberal platform, Mark Carney actually said the national electric grid would be on the Liberal platform. So yeah, it's there. I mean, unfortunately, that's right over the line where they say they're going to continue with the conventional oil and gas, but he's still talking about it. So I feel as if there has been, maybe there were people who were complaining enough that some of the politicians, at least, are waking up to the fact that climate is an existential threat, not just to our civilization, but to humanity's survival. So, and it's not going away. So to put that way down on the list of priorities is nonsensical. So I'm feeling a little more optimistic than I was when I wrote the article.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's talk about the electorate. You'd mentioned that, some of the polls had shown that, climate change and environmental issues had dropped to like sixth among those who were polled, with, housing, economy, cost of living, healthcare, and U.S. relations being the top five. What do you think is going on here? Do you think people have kind of tuned out of climate action? Have they given up a little bit, or are there just more pressing issues going on right now? Like, what do you think is going on with the electorate?
I think it's all of those things that you've just mentioned. Definitely people who can't find a place to live that they can afford, or are not going to be looking, ahead to, when we're all underwater or, when we have our next hurricane. They're just looking for a place to live. And people who can't afford groceries are also not going to be looking long term. But the fact is, the climate crisis is here. It's costing Canadians an enormous amount of money. In 2024, the insured losses in Canada were $8.5 billion from climate-related events. And that was triple the figure it was the year before in 2023. And if you calculate that the Insurance Bureau of Canada says that for every insured dollar, there are $3 to $4 spent to actually cover the costs of repairing the damage, that brings the climate-related damage in Canada in 2024 to $34 billion, which is almost what we paid for that pipeline. You could do a lot of subsidizing of solar and wind energy and putting in a national grid for $34 billion. You could even, get a high-speed train built for part of the way. So the thing is that I don't think people realize how much climate is costing them already. And there are places where you're really struggling if you can even get insurance on your property now. The insurance companies, unlike the oil and gas companies, are right at the forefront of this. They know what climate risks are. So I've kind of lost where I was, but I'm just thinking that it's not on people's agenda because there are the other priorities that seem more immediate, but it needs to be because that's part of the cost of living problem. Is climate. And the other big issue, of course, sadly, is disinformation. And if you spend any time on the cesspool that is X today, or even on Facebook, you will see
Instagram. I see anytime I see climate, anything on the internet now, it's wall to wall climate denial comments. Like I don't even see any comments anymore that are sort of like, this is real, this is happening. It's like they just don't even chime in the comments anymore. It's overwhelming.
Well, I mean, since Meta platforms banned any media articles, it's been overtaken by advertisements and memes. And the memes, as we know, half of those are bots. And they may be coming from Russia, but the advertisements are coming from these little astroturf groups that sound really great, like Citizens for Affordable Energy and all of these groups, but actually behind them is oil and gas money, big oil and gas money, and then of course they get shared. So you've got that amplifier effect. And if you go on any community Facebook page, which I'm very sorry to say here in rural Nova Scotia is where every Uncle Joe and Aunt Lily spend their day, that's what they're seeing. So they're actually, there's more climate denial now on the internet than there was 6 years ago. And that, I think, has had a devastating effect. We certainly know that's how the carbon tax was killed. It was total disinformation and misinformation. Yes, I will go along with the points that it was not well rolled out, but I, for one, am missing my rebate.
Yeah.
And I'm a rural dweller. So that was just, it was a really important piece of policy. And also the message of that policy is that we have to change the way we live and consume energy. And to me, when that was canceled, that was a little bit the message that was canceled too. Like, okay, we can throw our hands in the air. We couldn't do that. And I think that's a terrible mistake. I think this is the time to double down on those policies. And to be fair, I mean, the Liberals and the NDP and the Greens have said that, certainly they will keep the industrial carbon tax, but unfortunately the Conservatives and the others have said they'll scrap it, which would be catastrophic, which is basically what's happening to the south of the border. And as Thomas Arneson McNeil from the Ecology Action Centre said to me, if we're going to fight Trump, do we really want to do everything like Trump? And they are. They're destroying everything climate-related in the States. But they're certainly not in China. So if we're going to be taking examples on climate these days, we should probably look not south of the border. We should look elsewhere on the planet. And we should listen to people in the Caribbean, in Africa, who are pleading for us to do something about climate, because the people who have contributed the least to it are the people who are suffering the most from it.
Yeah, I do find it really frustrating and disappointing how kind of middle of the road centrist liberals, will, as soon as they face resistance or any sort of right-wing opposition to their policies, how quickly they will capitulate to right-wing framing and sort of like roll over on their backs and show their bellies and sort of go along rather than actually taking a principled stand, fighting, putting forward a different story, a different narrative, right? That and actually standing on their principles. How quickly they're willing to just sort of admit defeat and go along with the right-wing framing is really frustrating to me. And one of the things you talk about in your article is that sort of like in the absence of that alternative narrative, this creates an opening for the oil and gas industry to dominate the narrative, right? And so what is the story that the fossil fuel industry is telling right now? How are they using this moment as a Trojan horse for their interests? I know they recently wrote an open letter to all the party leaders. What's the story that they're telling right now?
Well, they're telling us that oil and gas, making more oil and gas production in Canada and making Canadian oil and gas available to Canadians from one coast to the other is a way that we can counter these tariffs and the problems that we're having, these threats coming from Trump with the tariffs. So the big thing that you're hearing the politicians talking about is a pipeline, east-west pipeline, whereas logistically, this is not an immediate solution to any problem that Trump is causing us, because we all know, first of all, a pipeline from the east to the west would take, at best, I can't even imagine how many years it would take. It would trample on Indigenous rights from Alberta all the way to Nova Scotia. The heavy crude that they have, we have no refinery out here that can deal with it. So even when they were planning that Energy East pipeline back in the day, it wasn't the federal government that stopped it. If you don't listen to the propaganda on the internet and pay attention to facts, it didn't go through because it simply wasn't viable. And the idea was not to provide the East Coast with prairie oil. It was to export it in the first place. So the whole notion that this pipeline, which has been raised, our own premier has raised it here in Nova Scotia. He's become very conservative recently. Oh, we have to have that. And he wrote a letter to Poilievre and to Carney saying that that's one of his wants to have is a pipeline to bring oil here. Well, it's just not going to happen. But as Thomas Arneson McNeil said to me, a power line is what we need. All of our power lines, where we have lots of hydro in Manitoba and Quebec and BC, they go south. We are exporting all our nice green energy to the United States. They don't even care if they have green energy anymore, obviously. Mm-hmm. And we have a problem and we want to fight back with their tariffs. So let's make sure that clean energy is available to adjacent provinces, which is what I learned from those very smart people I interviewed when I was doing my article. And so they're pushing more production, all environmental controls off, instant approval. In fact, Pierre Poilievre said he wants to have pre-approval for projects before they're even proposed. There is no proponent for a national pipeline. It's an emotional issue. It's like the carbon tax. It's being misrepresented. The facts are not there, and the public does not seem to have the facts available to them. We can come back again to the media, because I'm really good at criticizing the media being part of it. And of course, we know that the biggest media in Canada, National Post, are pretty right-wing and controlled by owned by an American hedge fund, and very pro-oil and very pro-conservative. And we have the Globe and Mail, which is a very blinkered, wonderful journalists there, but it's a very blinkered business publication. And the media they don't have the numbers anymore, and they're just not really doing their job. I hesitate to be critical of CBC, but I do it as a friend. And I hear constantly CBC hosts interviewing people about the election and everything else. And again, listing off, what is the biggest concern to you, housing or cost of living? I don't hear them ever saying, does climate or environment come in? So I would also beg that, hosts on CBC, our public broadcaster, also consider all of the issues, because especially for young people who are paying attention, it's terrifying. On one hand, they can say, yes, we're never going to have the houses that our parents, the boomers and the older generations had. Well, you want to have a planet too. We're not talking about just housing here. We're talking about a livable planet. And, if you want to have food, you have to do something about climate, because it's really affecting agricultural productivity the world over. So again, we come back to it's just a case of people paying attention to the bigger picture, that all of these things are connected, and not being influenced by this disinformation campaign, which also leaks over into the big media, I'm afraid.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about the candidates a little bit. Ironically, the candidate who seems to be speaking the loudest about climate, albeit indirectly, is Pierre Poilievre. Now, don't get me wrong, he's not out there mentioning the words climate change or saying he's going to do anything positive to address it, but his platform of axing the tax, cutting regulations, fast-tracking pipelines, is essentially an agenda to do nothing about climate change and let the world burn, right? So tell us a little bit more about Pierre Poilievre's climate agenda, if you can call it that, as well as, if you're aware, a little bit about his history as a longtime conservative attack dog and, member of Stephen Harper's government, and a sense of his entanglements with the oil and gas industry.
Well, he's more than a Harper boy. He's a Preston Manning boy. He goes way back. And I noticed that Preston Manning has also been he dragged himself out of retirement to pontificate on the national airways recently about how we need more oil and gas. Again, with Poilievre's slogans, even beyond the slogans, if you start asking for long sentences, if you're lucky enough to get to ask a question, he's going to tell you a whole lot of half-truths, or actually lies, and suggesting that a whole bunch of these LNG projects haven't gone through because of the federal government it's simply not true, because in some cases they haven't gone through even though they've got environmental approval. They've already got approval. The reason they're not going through is because they're not viable. Or the companies are basically holding the federal government to ransom to get more public money, to do more damage to the environment, which we then have to pay for in these climate-related costs. It used to be, I've done some research on old industries. I wrote a book about a pulp mill in Nova Scotia back in the 60s. It was built by an American company, and apart from the fact that we gave them a whole lot of free water and built a road for them and those things, they still built it themselves. Nowadays, it seems corporations expect the public to pay for everything, and then they waltz off with the profits and leave us with the mess to clean up. And that's where Poilievre's oil and gas, allowance would be. You can do whatever you want. You can drill as much as you want, and we're happy to clean it up for you. And he's just a politician. He knows nothing about science. He knows nothing about climate. All he knows is politics. That's his whole career, is politics. So he's really good at lying and building, rage farming, which is what he's been doing with the carbon tax, and now he's doing it with the pipeline. And it's simply not true that the federal government blocked the pipeline. And he wants to retract Bill 69? I think the Impact Assessment Act, which was such a progressive, I have very mixed feelings about Trudeau's Liberal government, because on one hand, I felt that they tried, but they were blocked at almost every turn. And as Catherine McKenna said, they should never have bought that pipeline. It was a big mistake. They did it. Yeah, the Trans Mountain, and then twinning it, which has cost us, $40 billion now? I forget. Yeah. And she regrets that they did it, but they did that to try to appease Alberta, which was a waste of time, because they'll never appease Alberta. So they made a lot of big mistakes like that, but they did bring in the Impact Assessment Act, which gave And it's not as if it was a double. I love it when they say there's 2 separate impact assessments and now there's only going to be one. All the federal impact assessments that I've looked at have been, it involves provincial experts and federal experts working together, and also a lot of recognition of Indigenous rights, which is a huge advance for Canada. And Poilievre wants to repeal that. So basically it will be a free-for-all out there on the oil patch. I can't even imagine what Canada, apart from the climate effects, what biologically, environmentally, and the biodiversity, what Canada would look like in 10 years under a Poilievre. I really can't. It's terrifying to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the other side, we've got Mark Carney and the Liberals, and as you mentioned, you kind of have to look backwards at Trudeau's legacy, and yeah, like you said, it's a mixed bag, right? On the positive side, he canceled the Northern Gateway pipeline. There was the tanker ban. I mean, I have a West Coast, perspective here. The Impact Assessment Act, all good things, but then you have to sort of weigh that against buying and ramming through the Trans Mountain pipeline against the wishes of many First Nations, the Coastal GasLink pipeline, and continued subsidies to the oil and gas industry. I mean, Trudeau is in a way more successful at getting pipelines through than Stephen Harper was.
Which is ironic. Because most of them didn't go through because there wasn't, the permission. They had permission for them, but they just didn't go ahead with them because they weren't viable. Right?
No, exactly.
And, I was surprised when I was writing recently about giant private equity companies in the United States that Coastal Link is actually mostly owned by a giant American private equity company, so... Wow, so, we're up against, people who care about climate and environment, unfortunately, are up against this behemoth, which is the oil and gas industry worldwide. And, it doesn't stop at the borders, whether it's Houston or Saudi Arabia or, Moscow. It's still the same lobby group. And Julia Levin gave me a figure for how many lobbyists, oil and gas lobbyists, are meeting with a Canadian politician in Ottawa every day. And I believe it's 5. It's wild. Incredibly heavy lobbying. Totally. And which is ironic. Again, we come back to Poilievre, who says he's against lobbying. Well, the biggest lobbyists of all are the oil and gas industry, whom he supports and who basically fund, as far as I can see, all his messaging and his campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you saw that article in Desmog by Geoff Dembicki, who sort of created that spider web chart of all of the connections from Pierre Poilievre and the federal conservatives to all these right-wing lobby groups, lobbyists, think tanks, oil and gas companies, Koch Industries. It's a whole network that he's kind of a part of. So the idea that he's opposed to lobbyists is kind of laughable. And then we've got Mark Carney, who is, it seems, and like you said, things have kind of changed since you wrote your article, but it seems like he's trying to do, classic centrist politics, trying to thread that needle, continuing with the incrementalism of Trudeau's climate agenda, while also, claiming that we can accelerate fossil fuel development, while also lowering our emissions, which seems highly dubious to me. I mean, the BC NDP have been saying that we could do that for years, but recent reports, so they were doing their Clean BC carbon reduction program while at the same time trying to develop LNG, and then it becomes clear that in all that time and the billions spent on trying to lower our carbon emissions, we've totally failed because LNG has undermined those efforts. And I think that we're going to find down the road that it will end up being the same thing in this case. So to try and triangulate and have it both ways makes no sense to me. Like, either you believe we need climate action and you're ready to meet the moment, or you don't, right? And Mark Carney, he's a banker. He was chairman of Brookfield Asset Management. He seems to be, while he does believe in climate change, he still is a capitalist at heart. So I don't know. What do you think of Mark Carney and what we might expect from him, and as if he were to become elected prime minister?
I'm just reading his book Value, Yeah. He did. I mean, to give him credit at the COP, whatever COP that was in Scotland, he did manage to rally the support of the international banking community to get them to commit to net zero. Of course, the minute Trump came to power, they all went fleeing and said, "Oh, we don't need to do that anymore," you know. So yes, I think it's very positive that we have someone running for prime minister who has a chance, perhaps, of winning, who does recognize that the climate crisis is a crisis and it's an existential threat. I think Canada has a really difficult problem dealing with climate change, and that is the fact that we're a federation. The fact that provinces have as much power as they do. And we've noticed recently that if you talk to the average Canadian, they don't have any idea what's provincial, what's municipal, and what's federal. And this is a big problem, which is why the joke goes around now, you know, if your water doesn't run, you know, blame it on Trudeau. It's because people really don't understand that the provinces have an enormous amount of control. So no matter what a federal politician wants to do, and I do believe that our former environment minister will probably never find an environment minister who cared as much about the environment as he did.
Stephen Guilbeault?
Yeah, and knew as much.
Yeah.
But there's the reality, the political reality in Canada is that that's not Ottawa's ballywag. They can't touch anything, as we know. They tried once, and you know Alberta doesn't forgive. They do forget that we fed them from the east during the Dust Bowl days back in the 30s, but they don't forget that. And I think that makes the political reality very, very difficult for someone who really wants to do something for climate and wants to win an election in Canada. Mm-hmm. And we certainly see it when they're up against all this disinformation and climate denial out there in the public sphere, and they're up against all of these politicians also playing politics with this pipeline business. So I have a great deal, remarkably, of sympathy for someone who really does care about the climate and wants to be the prime minister. You know, I did yell at my radio when I heard that he said that, you know, we can go ahead with conventional and we can do both at the same time, because that's a very liberal thing to do. But it's also, the political reality is you can't get elected if you don't say that. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's just realpolitik. It's very unfortunate I think it's unfortunate that Canada has this totally decentralized political system. I think if we had proportional representation, it would also make a big, big difference. I think, you know, on the list of Trudeau's mistakes, that one's number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, and number 5.
Yeah.
So if we did, then you would have parties that could really make climate and environment their whole platform, like the Green Party would like to. And they would actually get some representation that proportional to how many votes they actually get in the popular vote. So I think that's the political reality, yes. But, you know, this is the caught between the devil and the deep blue sea in a country where you're terrified of, you know, a Trump-like party that wants to take power and unleash the oil and gas industry on us as if they're not already unleashed on us. Mm-hmm. Obviously, most people are really hesitant to do that, so they're going to vote for the person that they think can defeat that oil and gas, basically the oil and gas party of Canada.
Mm-hmm. Well, just to wrap things up here, you know, this really has this moment with, you know, so much economic turmoil and uncertainty and just absolute maniacal behavior south of the border. You know, we've got to witness a real masterclass in disaster capitalism, as Naomi Klein calls it. And, you know, someone in your article said, fossil fuel industry never lets a crisis go to waste, to get their narrative out there. So my last question is, what should people who care about climate change, what story should we be telling people right now? You know, especially people who are primarily concerned about pocketbook issues, like, you know, and I, you know, that almost is minimizing it, like where they're going to live, how they're going to pay for their groceries. Like these are very urgent matters of survival, right? and climate change can sometimes feel like, even though you might think it's an urgent thing, it still just seems like it's a little bit later, for people who are more concerned about these immediate matters of survival, what story should we be telling about climate change? And the one sort of thing I will point to, and then I'll hand it over to you, is you pointed to this story in The Guardian. The climate crisis is on track to destroy capitalism, warns top insurer. Which is just so ironic to me. So take it from there. What story should we be telling right now about the threat of the climate crisis, but also the opportunity that it creates to build a different world and a different future in this moment of crisis?
I mean, I think for sure it's what, the people, the experts that I spoke with, I think that's the story, is that instead of our government putting $40 billion into the oil and gas industry as subsidies and allowing them, I would really love to see, I just wanted to come in here on this before I go any further. I forgot to mention that one of the wonderful things that happened in the last Parliament is that Charlie Angus, the NDP's Charlie Angus, introduced anti-greenwashing bill, which of course it was private members. It didn't go anywhere. That's another question I would have for Mark Carney. Are you going to do something about greenwashing, the carbon capture and storage, and all of these delay tactics of the oil and gas industry? But the real positive story is that for $40 billion, you can put in an enormous amount of solar, wind, and get that grid connected so that we're all one big happy electricity family right from one coast to the other, all three coasts. Add the train to that, and I think we're a country that is finally moving into the future and not backwards. Because if we allow that narrative that's coming from the oil and gas industry to influence the vote in Canada and the direction that we're going, then we'll be going right down that sump hole with Trump south of the border. And that is exactly what I don't think Canadians want to do. So the story is, if you really want to fight for Canadian sovereignty, fight for clean energy in Canada, invest in it. The jobs, think of the jobs there are in putting in that much solar and wind energy in Canada and getting us all connected on the grid. Again, we come up against that difficult provincial jurisdiction business, but I would love to see this as a national project. Just back in the day when they built the train, it's a national coast to coast project. Really build on that feeling of nationalism that Canadians are feeling right now in the face of the threats coming from Trump. It's a great story. It's a positive story.
It is, and it's almost metaphorical, like building an electrical grid that spans the whole country, links us all together through clean energy, while at the same time it's a big national project. It's a mammoth vision, and it's that sort of like those big. It's a big endeavor that would inspire people. I fully agree with that. And, the alternative, the question always that comes from the media, which I think is so disingenuous, is how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? But they never ask the question, how are we going to pay for not dealing with climate change? How are we going to pay for the mounting costs and the disasters? How are we going to pay for the fact that certain areas can no longer get insured? The costs of not acting far, far outweigh the cost of building a massive project like this that in the end would pay massive dividends for generations to come. So
I think we agree.
I think so too. Absolutely. Yeah. This was not an adversarial interview, Joan. It was a lot of fun talking to you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah, I really appreciate you being my first guest on the Cutblock, and I would love to have you back another time to talk about more of your reporting. I would love to talk about forestry with you and learn more about forestry in Nova Scotia, and that would be a lot of fun.
It would. I really appreciate being number one. I can't wait to listen to your podcast when it really gets going. It's going to be dynamite.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Joan.
Thank you.